Greetings and welcome to the Act React podcast. I'm Daniel Burkholder, a dance artist based in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, the ancestral lands of the Ho-Chunk, Menominee, and Potawatomi peoples. And I'm the host of this podcast. In this episode, I talk with Ishmael Houston-Jones. We talk about this briefly in our conversations, but the first time I remember seeing Ishmael perform was in the mid-1990s when he, Keith Hennessy, and Patrick Scully performed Unsafe, Unsuited at Dance Place in Washington, D.C. At the time, I was the associate technical director there, and I actually ran lights for their performance. It was a really important moment in my development as a young artist thinking about and exploring improvisation as a performance form. If you were one of the people who had the pleasure of seeing that trio in that work, you were certainly, say, in my humble opinion, it was one of the truly important works in the history of modern, kind of postmodern contemporary improvisational performance. It really pushed a lot of boundaries in terms of what was happening on stage and how it happened, and the fact that it was, Keith was from the West Coast, Ishmael was from the East Coast, and Patrick is actually from Minneapolis. It was kind of this bringing together of all these different lineages and practices in one performance. It was quite amazing to be able to see and watch and actually kind of collaborate as the lighting designer in that, because I was improvising the lights as well. So needless to say, it was a really honor to talk with Ishmael. And if you don't know him, here is some more information. Ishmael Houston-Jones is a choreographer, author, performer, teacher, and curator. His improvised dance and text work has been performed worldwide. He has received 3 New York Dance and Performance Bessie Awards for collaborations with writer Dennis Cooper, choreographers Miguel Gutierrez and Fred Holland, and composers Chris Cochran and Nick Hallett, and a 4th Bessie for contributions to the field of dance. Houston-Jones curated Platform 2012 Parallels, which centered on choreographers from the African diaspora and postmodernism, and co-created with Will Rawls Platform 2016 Lost and Found Dance, New York, HIV/AIDS, Then and Now. As an author, Houston-Jones' essays, fiction, interviews, and performance texts have been published in several anthologies. And his first book, Fat and Other Stories, was published by Yonkers International Press in June 2018. Houston-Jones is a 2022 recipient of the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation Fellowship. In 2024, he was awarded the Balasaraswati Joy Ann Dewey Benecol Endowed Chair for Distinguished Teaching Award from the American College Festival. His work has been supported by the Foundation for Contemporary Arts, the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, the Herb Albert Foundation, the Robert Rauschenberg Foundation, and the William and Flora Hewitt Foundation. With that, please enjoy my conversation with Ishmael Houston-Jones. Well, good afternoon, Ishmael, and thank you so much for joining me today on the Act React podcast. I'm excited to kind of talk with you a little bit about your process and your art making and improvisation. Great. So, yeah, definitely. I remember, I think the first time I saw your work or saw you perform and your work was when you were with Keith Hennessy and Patrick Scully doing Unsuited, Unsafe. Is that the
Unsafe, Unsuited.
Unsafe, Unsuited? Because I was the tech guy at Dance Place in Washington, D.C., and I actually ran lights for that performance.
Oh, wow.
And that was a couple moments ago. And I remember it being a really kind of, I think for myself, for my own artistic practice, an important experience to be in that, as the lighting designer, kind of working, following you all and trying to support you. And it was kind of towards the beginning of my experience of performing improvisationally as a dancer. So seeing that performance has really stuck with me. Like I can still feel like I have images in my head and moments from that performance that I can recall.
So it's really interesting because the piece was pretty much open. It was an improvisation with material that we'd gathered, but in each location that we did it, the lighting designer literally showed us some looks, and we told them to, improvise along with us, which is, some people took to it more than others.
I loved it. And I do remember, I think, there was a time around this time you can fade it. And around this time I faded the lights and you all were like, nope, the performance isn't done. Bring the lights back.
Really, I don't remember that.
Yeah.
I don't remember which performance where it was, but there was one where I was jumping and it was like a very good, but they brought the lights down really slowly and I thought I was going to die because I got into this jumping rhythm and they were we told them a very slow fade when they thought the end was coming and it was,
Yeah.
so yeah.
Getting your cardio workout for the day. So just kind of I mean, we've already started obviously, but just kind of a general question of thinking about improvisation specifically and right now in your life, how does improvisation show up both artistically, personally, however you want to think about that
Oh,
question?
improvisation, I mean, it's what I do. It's how I define my choreography. It's sort of like I very, very rarely set any movement. So it's always, and most recently, I did a reimagining a dance-based project here in New York of a piece that I did, a duet that I did with Fred Holland, who passed away in 2016. But we did a piece that was performed in 1983. It was the 11th anniversary of Steve Paxton naming Contact Improvisation. So there was a festival here. And Fred and I did this duet in which we strove to make a contact improvisation duet in which we were doing everything wrong. So we did a score that we were doing. And it became sort of hidden. It was very different from all the other contact improv that was done in the festival. And it sort of went away. And then it's sort of in the early 2000s, I think mainly through the work of Karen Nelson, she found the videotape. It was shot by Kathy Weiss and Lisa Nelson on the two different occasions. And she began showing it, and then it began circulating. And the director at Dance Space Project here has been asking me for like the last 10 years if I want to revive it somehow. And then with Fred's passing, and I just sort of thought it was sort of so much about us and who we were as two Black men in the contact improvisation scene, sort of in it and outside of it at the same time, that I always resisted it. Then finally I just decided, well, maybe I could try to do it. So I got three people to do it, so it's not a duet anymore. It's a trio. We did it in February at Dance Space. Stephanie Hewitt, Chris Lee, and AJ Wilmer are three young African-American women, femmes. And they're also DJs, so they sort of set up a DJ booth. So they sort of did, and they wrote their own manifesto. Fred's and mine was sort of based on this secret manifesto that the audience wasn't privy to, but I had them, and as we began working on it, I showed them a lot of the videotapes of Fred and me and a lot of archival stuff from Fred Holland and myself. And, but I also showed them the manifesto, our secret manifesto, and I had them write one for themselves. So it's very open, and we did it 3 nights. I think we're going to do it again in January here in New York. All 3 nights were remarkably different. And yeah, so yeah, improv is still like, it's the material I work with.
Yeah. So I'm curious about when you're like recreating, reestablishing, resetting, however we want to name it, a work like that that's obviously improvisational. What are the essence things that you want to carry forward? Like how do you determine like what's the thing that is the same, that makes it the same piece or something?
But I think in this one particular case, I think sometimes things are different. In this one, it was really sort of like giving them the freedom to actually state what they were going to do in a manifesto, but the manifesto is like not about movement at all. It's about them as people. They each wrote one, and then they combined all 3 of them. And they took my workshop in January at Movement Research. So they sort of got what sort of my prompts were, or what my ways of working with others is. But, yeah, that was like really interesting. It was sort of alchemical. I don't know how that one worked at all. it was just sort of like giving them a lot of history. They sort of really got invested in Fred. We made an altar to Fred. I got a lot of his objects and some of his clothing, actually, and even his old passport somehow I got a hold of. And we set up an altar in the space for the dancing. So that one was very sort of almost magical how that came together. Another revival I did was Them, which was a piece I did with Dennis Cooper, the writer Dennis Cooper and Chris Cochran. And it was made in 1986. And we did a revival of it in 2010 and another in 2018. And that one was very different because that one was very highly scored. There were really dance scores that were improv scores. Like none of the movement was actually set, but there were definitely things, events that happened along the way.
Yeah.
Related to Dennis's writing, which he read live, and Chris's music that he did a backing track that was pre-recorded, but then he would improvise with electric guitar over it. That one was specifically for 6 male identified dancers who Dennis's writing. Are you familiar with Dennis Cooper's writing at all?
I'm not, unfortunately.
It's
No.
very transgressive queer core writing. It's very sort of sexual, graphic, and violence. And in 1986, which of course was at sort of the height of the AIDS crisis, it was sort of very important to like do that. We got the most negative review I've ever gotten was from the gay press about that piece. They hated it. Literally, it, you could sort of feel the critic trembling as he was typing because it was very harsh. It was not a pleasant piece. There's a scene in which in the 1980s I did it, and then in the revival another dancer did it. Does this duet with a goat carcass, like a dead goat, and which was sort of for me symbolizing in sort of Christian mythology, sort of the evil, the AIDS thing. It's on a mattress. It takes place on a mattress, but also the sort of like desire, and so things like that happen. And so in reviving that piece, the improv was giving this younger generation, some of them weren't born in 1986, right, like what queer life was like in 1986 and what those references were. There's a specific duet, which was just derived from street cruising. And Chris and I and Dennis and I had to explain what street cruising was in the gay context. Like no swiping. You would walk down the street and they say, "You really did that?" And it's a really beautiful duet, like in the piece where they're just passing each other until it gets really frenzied. So yeah, so there are different ways of like going into improvisations, and it's always a question like what makes an improvisational piece a piece? And it's, I mean, the question, yeah. So like, what is that? Like, what is the essence of it? What makes it that piece, that piece?
Mm-hmm.
And in the case of Them, it's very clear because it's sort of anchored around Dennis's writing, which stayed the same. And Chris's, even though he's improvising on guitar, there's still sort of a sense of what the music score will be. Mm-hmm. But in this most recent one, in Oogala, it's the title of the piece, the trio is Oogala, OO-GA-LA. And it just comes from a sound of a soundtrack that we were using, that Fred and I were using, that sounded like that. So we just called it that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. I mean, like describing those two works is really wonderful. And you brought up the question that I was already kind of starting to, I think, formulate and think about is like, when we think about improvisational performance, how much or how little are we scoring it? Are we structuring it? Are we framing it? And those two works seem fairly different in terms of that. And I would love to hear a little bit more about just your process of when when you start making a work, when you start like thinking about, oh, I'm going to like make a work and start going into the creative process. What does that look like for you? And I know it can end up many different places, but curious about just like what happens when you go into the studio to start working.
I was laughing because Fred and I never went into the studio. We would go out to clubs at midnight and, do
or
substance, do
yeah,
substances and
yeah, yeah.
around.
Whatever the research is, there's all kinds of research, and it's
Yeah.
all right.
Um, yeah, that's a very interesting question because, and it's always kind of different. The piece that you referenced in the beginning, Unsafe, Unsuited, was proposed by Patrick Scully. He got some funding from the Jerome Foundation.
Mhm.
And that one was a very interesting process, very different from the two I just described, because the original proposal was that there were three queer men who lived in three cities in the United States who all worked in improvisation, but who had never worked together before. And in fact, I didn't know Keith. I met Keith on the first day of rehearsal. Like, I didn't even know who he was,
Yeah,
actually. Um, we worked in all three cities, putting it together. That was sort of important that we worked in New York, Minneapolis, and the Bay Area in California. And Keith Hennessy has this philosophy that anytime you're working on something and you're together, you're rehearsing. So if we went to a restaurant, we were rehearsing. If we went to a bar, we went to the sauna, we were rehearsing. Or we were in the studio, we were also rehearsing. We also, that kind of rehearsing too. And we just started, in that process, we just started gathering material. I mean, you saw one iteration of it in DC. We had things that we liked and things that we kept and things we kept for a while and then discarded, or things that we discarded and came back. That was just sort of the impetus, was us being, the three of us being together. That was sort of the impetus of making a piece. Um, and the piece that Fred and I did in 1983, it was just that we are these two guys who do contact improvisation, but we are outside of the contact world. So how do we show that? How are we gonna express that? What is unique to us in the contact world and in our positioning in that world? And then it was like a desire to work with Dennis Cooper. Like, his writing frightened me. So when he moved to New York from California, every people from California knew him, and I never heard of him. And I went to a reading of his, and it terrified me. I literally was afraid. I don't think I've ever been affected by literature in such a way.
Hmm.
A piece called "Tenderness of the Wolves," and the specific piece was called "A Herd," and it's the story of a serial killer of young boys, but it's told in the voice of the killer, the boy, and God. And it was the most chilling thing I've ever read, or I heard him read it. And also, he has a very Southern California flat accent, so it's like he's reading all of these really sort of emotional and transgressive things, and in this very flat voice, which I really love working with him for that. And Chris, similarly, he was in several punk bands in the 80s, and I went to hear him at a club. I didn't go specifically to hear him, but he was playing, and I guess I never heard anybody make music the way he was using his guitar. So I just asked both of them individually, like, you want to try something, make something? Neither of them had worked with dance before, and wound up being this sort of really celebrated piece. Um, So yeah, it's different. It's like very different empathy, like very different starting points. Like, it's sort of very intuitive, actually. It's sort of like less calculated, less strategized, and much more intuitive. Like, this is what I'm interested in today.
Yeah.
Where will that
Well,
lead me?
could maybe you could also talk, it's nice to hear you talk through the different pieces and how you're like coming together and stuff like that. There's a lot of good information in there that I'm curious about. And so maybe one of your more recent pieces that I was just watching the little video trailer on Try,
Mm.
and because that's a group piece, and it seems like it's had a couple iterations, and I'm wondering if you could just talk about that piece a little bit in the same way, like what was the impetus of bringing people together, maybe what the rehearsal process was like and the performance process.
Oh,
uh,
sure.
yeah.
Yeah, that piece was it was put together by a grant, actually. It was Keith Hennessy applied for a grant in California from the Hewlett Foundation, as in Hewlett Packard.
Hmm.
Um, They gave us an incredible amount of money. One of the stipulations in the grant was that the lead person in it could not be a member of the company that was applying, I think. So I was brought in as a choreographer, but I'm actually not really the choreographer.
Right.
I mean, it was very collaborative. I started off sort of like leading, and also it started in the fall of 2020, which means I was on the East Coast, everybody else was on the West Coast, and I couldn't travel because of COVID, the COVID restrictions, until I got vaccinated. Um, so I didn't travel. I guess I could have, but I didn't. So the first 4 months of rehearsals were over Zoom. And I didn't know any of the people except for Keith, the other four, uh, Kevin, Snowflake, and Jose. I didn't know at all. Um, so we met over Zoom and we rehearsed over Zoom, which was a very interesting process.
Yeah.
Uh, and it seems like it wouldn't work, but it actually, in some level, just because we weren't meeting in sort of a neutral studio and everybody was in their own environment, it sort of we got closer somehow when I finally went there in, I guess, January of the next year when I got vaccinated. It was interesting. I felt like I knew them better than I would have if we had met in the studio because, I saw them. I saw their cats walking by, their boyfriends in the background, their books on how they decorated their apartments. Like I got to really sort of see who they were in this really more intimate way. And we did sort of exercises. We did exercises of proximity, using the screen as a space, as a communal space, using the screen as studio, which was interesting also. But then I went out there and we went north of San Francisco to a retreat space where we were isolated. We were all alone. We brought another dancer who's a chef who cooked for us, and we were there for 2 weeks, and we just started making stuff. Again, that's sort of my métier. It's sort of a collages. I collect. As I said, I when you right before we got on Zoom here, my assistant and I were like going through archives. I just have borderline hoarding. Like I just keep everything, and then somehow I'll pull something up and use it. I mean, that's sort of how I work. And so we were working very collaboratively. We were each giving prompts to each other. We knew that everybody was born male, but we all had very different gender expressions, and we wanted to highlight that. Snowflake Calvert is indigenous Mexican, and he brought there was a lot of conversation about land acknowledgement and acknowledgement of culture and how one is in what land one is in
Mhm.
and identifying that because there were only actually she and I were the only ones who were born in the United States because two people were born in Canada and one was born in the Philippines. So we were really investigating land, and also because we started off on Zoom on the internet, we also wanted to acknowledge that because a lot of resources in native lands and indigenous lands are used to make internet happen, making this. So, and then some of the people were really involved in circus and aerial work. Keith and Kevin were both, and that sort of things from each of our lives just sort of like got put into that piece.
Mhm.
But so it wound up being this really incredible mishmash of like personalities and origins. We did a lot with origin stories, we did a lot of writing, we did a lot of origin stories, we did a lot of healing rituals, and yeah, it was very different from a lot of my other work. And as I say, it's really not mine solely. It's like mine and with the group, made with the group.
Yeah. So just in that work, like you collected all of this stuff, and like you talk about collage that make, I mean, from doing the little videos that's online that I see of it, it does feel very collage. I mean, it's very colorful. It has lots of things going on, or it appears that way in the videos. What's the score? What's the structure score? Is it open with all this stuff that you know might happen? Is there any kind of sense of
We usually have some sort of opening ceremony that brings us together, brings the audience into the piece. Sometimes it's song, sometimes it's spoken. In the earlier versions, we talked about the lands in which the piece were made because we also got a residency on Fire Island to work to make it here in New York, and then we worked in several places on the West Coast also, and so we talk about how the land affected the work. Sometime we made a song. I think it's been dropped now. Um, and then Kevin O'Connor is really interested in sort of fascia, like the fascia between muscles and bubble theory. And then some of his teachings when we were working, he began talking a lot about bubbles and how bubbles are all interconnected, like they all share walls with each other. And then we started thinking about we wanted to get a bubble machine. It is like I think someone just said it, and we said, okay, we went online and ordered a bubble machine, which became an integral part of the piece actually. And when we just did it last year in Austria, in Vienna, we had to find it. We brought our old, which was actually it was made for children's parties, and it really lasted longer than it should have. And they had to find a new bubble because ours was dead. So the piece is sort of structured. We know the aerial work happens at a certain, will happen around the same time each time. There's this thing we found when we were working on Fire Island. There's a lot of bamboo, and it was still toward the end of the pandemic. So we got like 6 feet of bamboo stakes of 6 feet, so we could work together and be 6 feet apart, but still in contact. Um, we knew that the bubble machine would make a mess. It would make the floor wet. So it always happens toward the end, very much toward the end. But between like whatever the beginning is and the end with the bubble machine, there's sort of no real set score, no set script or score. Like things just happen. And
That's great. Yeah, yeah. Thank you for kind of like talking through that. That's great. When looking kind of at like all the work you've talked about and other works you've done as well, do you find that there's certain themes that you feel like you coming? Sometimes I think like all of us artists, we just keep making the same piece over and over again
yeah.
because we're trying to figure it out. So wondering if there's any like overarching themes that have been especially compelling or important to you.
Sort of resistance, I think. There's always a sense of the politics of dancing, what happens with the body. What does it mean to put a body in space, and how is that perceived? And like, how is that being read? How are bodies being read? It's always sort of there in the ether. Gender I often work with male identified people, which was really interesting when I did the reimagining of Ugala to use three femmes.
Yeah.
The piece was originally made with Fred and myself, which was sort of I wanted to sort of counter the sort of the hyper masculinity of Fred and me doing contact. It was sort of like it needed that energy to make it to actually reimagine it. But gender often plays some part both in them and Unsafe, Unsuited, and Try all were sort of gender was a large part of the reading of those pieces. Um, Race and belonging or not belonging.
Mm-hmm.
I think there are other themes. Sort of like I come out of political protests for various reasons, either a lot of marching for either gay rights or civil rights for African Americans like myself. during the height of the AIDS crisis, 80s through 90s. A lot of my pieces referenced AIDS in different ways. On Prologue to the End of Everything was sort of a fantasia about that. Um, yeah, I'm and like
Yeah.
my own and using sort of I always refer to my work as autobiographical fiction.
Mhm.
Using my biography as source material, but obviously artistically changing it.
Mhm.
That happens in my writing as well. So
Yeah, I mean, for me, I remember when I really started um, performing improvisationally specifically, it felt like the work that I was doing, the performance that I was doing, was more autobiographical, even if it wasn't so explicitly that.
right,
Like there was when I was like doing more choreographed work, it felt like I was like it was a little bit like I was putting on a coat and like here's this thing I can do,
hmm,
and all of a sudden improvisationally it was like, oh no, this is me. Even if I'm in a very tight score or doing something really specific, it's still the more of an essence of me in the moment.
right. Yeah, I feel that as well. I mean, then there are other pieces like Relatives, which is with my mother, which a piece I made with my mom. Um, but it was also, I mean, it was also about Ray. It was about sort of the migration of my family from Mississippi to Pennsylvania. So, but I carry my mother onto the stage, and she speaks about the family. Um, and Without Hope is sort of about the death of my friend John Byrne, and I sort of wrestle. I do a contact improvisation with a cinder block, and so yeah, the biography is sort of there, lurking always. I think I don't know how it cannot be actually. I mean,
Yeah, yeah, I think that's probably right. So maybe shifting gears just a little bit, but within this context that you've just kind of set up for us, um, thinking about not being necessarily as a performing artist, though I'm sure they're really tightly linked, is like, what does it mean to be a teacher, and kind of how do you teach improvisation?
that's a really good question. I sort of am trying to think. There are certain specific situations in which teaching happens. One is like sort of the workshop, which is sort of self-defined, where I can self-define what I'm teaching, which means I bring in a bunch of stuff, a bunch of ideas. Usually starting with both, and then there's the academic teaching, where I teach in New York University and Bennington College. Um, so those are like very sort of different. It sort of shifts the focus a little bit. The material is often the same, but like how I present it. When I'm teaching myself, I just bring in stuff. I almost never plan classes when I do my workshops. It's very rare that I'll say, oh, you know, Monday I'm going to go in and we're going to do X, Y, and Z. I just don't do that. I sort of go in, read the room. Since the pandemic, actually, it's been sort of like in the more academic sense, definitely that there's always a check-in in classes, like everyone. And sometimes the classes are large, so the check-ins can take a while. But just to be where people are on any specific day rather than, and that just sort of has become sort of like the way my classes often start. Then they often start with free writing. Almost all of my classes start with free writing to get language going and to get ideas and just to get people into their own thought processes. I work a lot with eyes closed, just sort of to because we human beings tend to be very visually oriented people, creatures. Um, Sort of get people more tuned into their other senses, and there are dozens of scores of exercises I do with using sight or lack of sight or mixed sight with people working together with one sighted and one not. Um, Getting people speaking while they're moving is also really in getting people to tell stories as they're moving. Um, Getting people to read bodies. Actually, a lot of my work tends to be putting a body in space and have other people read it. and then adding another and another, and layering the read and making the reading more complicated.
Could you speak a little bit more about that? Like, what do you mean by read bodies, and what are the even maybe an example of what you might do in class to.
I mean, it starts with a very simple prompt. We'll all be on one side of the room, and I'll say, can one person put their body in space and hold it in a position that's comfortable enough for that you can hold for a while?" And I ask the rest of the class to read that body, just to say, "What is that to you?" And usually without speaking first, just sort of like, and then I'll say, can another body be put in that space, and have people assess how adding one body next to another or away from another or close to another changes the read, and then adding another and another and another and another until we have built. And then I start asking people to start verbalizing what the story is. What is the story? What is the picture? What is the narrative? What is the image? And then often I ask them to, as we go on, to tell what they're seeing, but ignoring the fact that they're human beings. Like, they can be anything. They can be stones. They could be trees. They could be thoughts. They could be energy. They could be light. But to actually give an accurate reading of what you're seeing. And then it evolves more into like changing the read by moving one person, removing a person, adding a person, everyone changing positions on one count, and seeing what that does. And then having people construct sort of almost like a flip book
Hmm.
of images one to another, where the viewers would be watching with their eye and then closing their eyes, and as people change, so that the images and creating whatever, either a narrative, or in story or sculpture,
Mhm.
just getting people to see that. And there are other exercises also of just reading bodies in space. I think is really.
And does that then translate to, like, so one, you're the audience or the witness, like seeing this and reading it, and then do you imagine that that skill translates into when they're inside the
Yeah,
action?
and yeah,
Yeah.
it does. There's sort of another version of it where people are just. I want people to be aware of what the images that they're creating, and that your body is always being read somehow. There's no such thing as a neutral body. Which also brings us to questions of race and ethnicity too, because in sort of Western culture, white bodies were considered neutral, and not white bodies were the other. So I'm also trying to get away from that paradigm.
Do you address that explicitly within the class?
It depends.
Yeah.
I mean, if I'm working with, maybe not if I'm working with sort of undergrad, first year students. Yeah. Usually interject it somehow, maybe not that explicitly.
Yeah.
If I'm working with a workshop of more adult people, then yeah, it would be. Or it depends on what the focus of the workshop is also.
Sure. 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 That makes sense. Um, that's great. Um, when you're working with students, whether it's in a workshop or over a semester, right? Yeah, like with in a university setting, um, you've already spoken about this desire for them to be able to read bodies and understand how they're being read by being inside the improv. Do you differentiate any way in terms of what's happening in class, what might be performance, what might like the different ways improvisation might be kind of used within the artistic practices, or is it really mostly focused towards as an improvisational practice
Um,
or
uh,
performance
Usually,
practice?
I mean, it depends on what the workshop or class is. I mean, if
Sure.
it's leading toward performance, then it definitely is toward using improvisational skills to make performance and to make, sorry to say. good performance. Not to be
Oh
judged,
boy, that's
not to be
that's
judgmental
a
or
whole question in itself, right?
as opposed to like some other kinds. If it's just an experiential workshop, then it maybe not.
Yeah.
Most of my workshops, I think, tend to be. I'm meeting Keith on Thursday. We're going to Vermont together
Oh,
to teach
nice.
at the Field Center, and it's basically a performance. There's an idea that it will end in people making performances. We've done it before. People make short performances of their own, working together or in solo. Um, the semester I just taught at NYU culminated in people making performances. So I think often my work is about that. My workshop in movement research was not so much about it. It was more experiential. But often I teach toward, I mean, I think it's important that people learn how to improvise in a performance and to actually know that, as my assistant was, David was just here and, he found this thing I wrote, a course description for something at Movement Research years ago, in which I was rejecting the dichotomy of improvisation versus choreography. That I think all dance that's being made to be performed is choreography, and it's just a difference in temporality. If you're doing things that are made to be repeated as closely the same way each time, that is set choreography. If you're making something that you're doing the choreography with concerns about time and space and rhythm, then that's improvisational choreography. I mean, I think what I do is I call what I do choreography. I call it improvisation, but as I call it I am a choreographer. I choreograph dances. They're improvised. The choreography is just improvised.
Yeah. Yeah. So, that's great. That it's like a continuum, not a like this or that type thing. So what drew you? I mean, just kind of zooming out, maybe we'll just like take a couple more minutes here, kind of zooming out, like why do you imagine or do you think you were so drawn to more improvisational choreography than set choreography? Like what about that offered you something?
You want the truth?
Well,
I really suck at learning set choreography. I'm really, really, really bad at it. And some people don't believe me. They've tried to put me in pieces, and I tell them up front now, I don't learn, I don't learn movement. I've not been diagnosed, but I think I'm sort of movement dyslexic because left right confuses me a lot. And when I started dancing, I was a theater kid in high school, and then a friend of mine told me about some free dance classes that the community theater was offering for teenagers because they wanted to get teenagers in their plays. So I started, and I said, well, "This is great," because I was not a sports kid. I didn't do sports, but I had a lot of energy, and I liked the idea of performing. And all of a sudden, I discovered dance, and it was just like, oh, there's this thing that's, I mean, emitting all of this energy. There are no balls involved and no teams. And I really liked it, but I was really bad at actually learning steps. And when I moved to Philadelphia after dropping out of college, I got into a company called Group Motion Media Theater in Philadelphia, and it's the only company I've ever been in. They were they were both the directors were German. They were from the Bigman School in Berlin. They immigrated to Philadelphia. So their work was always improv based. Like there were some steps that you had to learn, but it was basically there were a lot of improv games. And I really liked that for a while. And then person Terry Fox, who's still in Philadelphia, still working in Philadelphia, had also dropped out of the company. And we began just working with musicians, like improvised musicians. And I thought, this is great. And this is great. Let's just make improvised work. It has this sort of celebrate the validity of improvisation, and that you can make it better because also I saw a lot of really bad improvisations. It wasn't, especially in regard to time. Like some improvisers have no sense that they're working with time. Um, and So this Terry and I began teaching at her loft in Old City, Philadelphia. And then when I moved to New York, I just sort of like, and I got involved with contact improvisation early. And I just sort of, and yeah, the truth is I'm really bad at learning steps, but I really like to dance. So
Yeah.
improvisation is where I got it. Even in a piece of Miguel Gutierrez's I was in, it was based on our all of the dancers, he videotaped our improvisations, and then we were supposed to learn. I couldn't learn my own improvisation. I couldn't, like, I was there looking, it was impossible. Like, it was like totally impossible. So, yeah, that's the dirty secret, the dirty little
Yeah.
secret.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I don't know if, is there anything else that I forgot to ask that about improvisation that interests you or concerns you or inspires
Oh,
you?
so I think it's just, it's really, I think I came out of a time where my time in Philadelphia, which was in the 1970s, there was like this sort of improvisation was sort of this sort of stepchild to to dance, especially to academic dance programs. It was not in programs at all, and even in sort of like the dance world, it was sort of like improv was sort of looked down upon or looked at as this thing that wasn't as good. And I'm glad that that has changed, but I think it needs to change more. That people really need to acknowledge that there is a craft, there is a way of really working on that. I work on improvisation. It's like it's not just doing whatever. Like a lot of my students come in. So I work mainly with theater students at NYU. I'm in the drama department, not the dance department. And, they think, oh, improv, I can just, turn on some music and do whatever I want. And I have to like, focus them that it is a craft, a skill, and there are things to learn about it.
Yeah. Yeah, I just got done teaching our freshman improv class here this semester and talking with them at the end of the semester. They were basically the same thing. It's like, oh, I always thought improv, you just like turn on some music and do your best dance moves.
Mm.
And they're like, oh, I didn't realize it was like so many more options um, in practice. So, well, Ishmael, thank you so much for joining me today and talking about your improvisational practice and your art practice and all the work that you've done, which is so vital to the community. I've seen you a couple times, but certainly followed you from afar for much more intensely than that. And so it's really great to have you as part of this little podcast.
Well, great. Well, thanks for inviting me.
Definitely. All right. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Ishmael and learned a lot about his artistic practice and the ways that he is out in the world. Episodes drop every other Thursday. So the next episode will arrive September 18th, and that'll be my conversation with Jonathan Morris. Jonathan is a composer based in Washington, D.C., and he and I collaborated for well over a decade on many, many of kind of some of what I consider some of my most important works, or certainly the works I am most fond of. So we had a really great conversations, and I look forward to sharing that with you on the 18th. In the meantime, please follow our social media. You can find me, Daniel Burkholder, on Instagram and TikTok. And we've got an Act React profile on Facebook and YouTube. And we'll be dropping video excerpts from previous conversations from the archive, as well as some kind of fun quotes that we've pulled from some of the conversations. So stay tuned and keep an eye out for those. And also please subscribe to this podcast, whether you listen to it on podcast app or YouTube. Helps us get it out there in front of other people. So I look forward to sharing more episodes as the season continues. And until then, live spontaneously.